Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to yet another edition of an Evolved Review. I love that intro so damn much. One of these days I might actually change it, but it's going to be a while. We are here tonight talking about part 2 of the excellent Brian Pillman episodes of Dark Side of the Ring. I am joined here each and every week by none other than Caleb Stovall of the SWN. The man has consumed more wrestling content than anyone in the multiverse. Caleb, welcome back, man.
Hey, what's going on? And I'm also technician, independent #1 for those fans out there.
and your very reliable hat that has made an appearance, I think, on every episode of this podcast, just about.
Yeah, again, I wasn't going to do that every episode, but then our awesome artists that did our artwork there for the show put it on me, so I was like, well, guess this is my gimmick hat now.
That's it. And speaking of pointless gimmicks, we have joining us today none other than from the Superhero Homies podcast, Superhero Homie Q, Quentin A. Spickler. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, I think I'll be taking my exit now. This has been great, guys.
I was about to say it'll be the last time now that.
God damn. How you gonna bury me before the match even starts?
I did not mean to turn this into the Comedy Central roast of Superhero Homie Q, but Caleb just set me up for it so well, man.
I mean, did he though?
It was for that.
It was the best segue in the history of podcasting. I mean, I had no choice.
That was one of those where we did not discuss this beforehand. We just called it out in the ring there, Ace.
Sometimes you got to call it in the ring, man.
Hey, yeah, sometimes you got to pre-plan this shit, too.
Yeah.
I saw Caleb spike the ball, and I was like, wham! I'm so glad that we are getting the levity here in the beginning and the laughs out, because there probably won't be a whole lot in this episode. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, you can probably see here we are talking about Brian Pillman Part 2. We covered Part 1 already. It's already out there and you can watch it. And it's on Vice. Part 1's actually on YouTube. I don't know if Part 2 is on YouTube, but they released it ahead of time, so we got an advanced review out there. When it aired on Vice, they actually aired it as a 2-part, like, kind of doubleheader to open up the season. Same way they did with the Chris Benoit episodes, which we also covered. So, yeah, you can find it out there, and now we're going to cover Part 2 of it. To refresh your memory a little bit, if you don't remember, Part 1 ended with the accident, the vehicle accident that he had. They just kind of briefly touched on it there at the very end of the first episode. So we open Part 2 with them actually talking about him being in the hospital following up this tragic accident. And, we have Linda talking about him being in the hospital. We have Melanie basically walking into the room and saying, "That's not my husband." That Pillman looked, he was so absolutely just devastated from this accident that he didn't even look anything like himself. Ace, what was your reaction to that?
Yeah, I was like, how horrific of an accident was this that your significant other can't even recognize you? And the way that she described him was horrific. And you can only imagine like the kind of pain that Pillman was in, regardless of what kind of medication they may have had him on. But when I saw that, I was like, yeah, that's got to be traumatizing for everybody involved.
This man basically, from the way they describe it, he broke and crushed as many bones as you can break and crush without dying. Was kind of the opinion that I had of it. They talk about like them peeling his face down and having to put the plates in to hold his face together. And then it's a medical miracle that you can do that and the person lives, right?
Yeah.
Caleb, what did you think about this?
I had no idea that the accident was that terrible.
Right.
Like we had heard for years that he had been in an accident and that it crushed his leg and stuff like that. I didn't know that it basically ruined his entire facial structure and whatnot. Just I can't even imagine. I mean, dude, I've been in a wreck before. I had that happen to me when I was on delivery for Stakeouts, one of the worst wrecks I've ever had. And nothing happened to me, thank God. But looking at that, like it brought me flashbacks to that. It was difficult to watch, man, and it was difficult to hear. But right then, when I heard that, I was like, oh man, we haven't even gotten to his death yet, and they're just already just poking you with it. They're like, yep, this is Dark Side of the Ring. Remember that, folks.
Like, yeah, if anybody watched the first episode and they were like, that was more of a documentary. Like, it wasn't really that Dark Side of the Ring ish. Episode 2 for you. Here we go.
Yeah. It's like, oh boy, what are we in for this time?
Yeah, I mean, Pillman was launched from the vehicle.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was ejected from the vehicle. He did not consent either. And on top of that, it's like the timing couldn't have been any worse. I mean, because if you look back at the end of part 1, he was in the midst of like negotiations and things were really heating up for him. Like, and then this happens, like just a horrific car accident that just physically ruins this man. Awful timing.
I mean, in the mainstream, on TV and the dirt sheets and everything, this thing was hugely downplayed. I mean, there was all these rumors that like he was getting facial surgery to try to look like a fake Shawn Michaels, and like people saying that he was just taking time off, and you know how people are very eager to assume that anything in wrestling is a work, right? Everything has to be a work. Mm-hmm. Even when the simplest answer is so far from being a work. Everybody has to assume that everything is a work, especially during this time when like the dirt sheets were kind of just becoming more of a thing that people were getting a hold of. The internet wrestling community, or the IWC, was really forming during this time. So the rumors are flying everywhere, regardless of whether there's any truth to them. And they, the official story really downplayed this accident. I mean, his foot was fused into a walking position. That's the only way they didn't have to amputate it.
Yeah.
So the man could not run. He was not going to ever be a ring technician again. He was not ever going to be a good professional wrestler again. And everybody, I think, saw the writing on the wall for that, except for him. And I think he probably knew, but it was probably everything he could do to continue to go on. He probably had to tell himself, like, hey, this will get better, and I can do this again. But, I mean, really, he was lucky just to be breathing.
Yeah.
After this accident. At your own peril, Google what the survival rate is when you get ejected from the vehicle during a car wreck.
Yeah, it's not very good. And we heard a very rare out of character appearance that he did a long time ago on like a radio show at the time. Like you heard that radio clip of him. So
yeah. I mean, Cornette even goes into like all the rumors that the other workers were talking about at the time. They were basically like, the boys were thinking that it was a work, that it was part of the loose cannon gimmick, because Pillman's gimmick blurred those lines between what was real and what was a work so well. I mean, it's kind of a testament to him that he could even work the workers.
Yeah.
But I almost wish that he had ran with the fake Shawn Michaels thing, like, right? Like I low key wish he had played into that one, because that one is so batshit crazy and off the wall. It's just ridiculous. It would have been great if he had just leaned into it.
Yeah, I mean, and what's interesting is like, they just signed him to WWE, and one of the things they don't really talk about a ton, or at least they don't focus on it, Pillman is one of the few people to ever get a guaranteed contract from WWE. Because this was during the time of the Monday Night Wars. They were desperate to bring in people who were going to make a splash. They were desperate to make new stars. And Pillman Jr. not Pillman Jr. I'm used to saying Jr. after Pillman. Pillman Sr. was going to be one of those stars. He was going to be, the guy. He was going to be this loose cannon gimmick, and so he had a guaranteed contract. He was, as long as he didn't violate it, he was going to get the money. And so on his side, he wanted the money and needed to take care of his family, so he was showing up to work. And on the other side of it, Vince is like, this guy can't wrestle, but I just signed a contract to pay him X amount of dollars for 3 years. I got to do something with him. So they made a big deal out of it. They had a contract signing on air. And Jim Ross is like, this guy's never going to be able to work a match. Like, not really, He's never going to be back where he was at. So Austin talks about them bringing him in. Were either of you, I think all of us here were mainly WCW people, but were either of you, watching WWE product at this time when they brought him in?
I was actually a WWF kid, and I consumed more WWF than WCW. And I was. And this was, as a kid, this was my first exposure to Brian Pillman.
Gotcha.
And so like it was interesting for me because, of course, they made. I remember them making the whole big deal about, this is Stone Cold's, former, partner. I remember, them drumming up some sort of history between those two. But for me, I'm like, that's not true. Like, these guys never worked together. Because and of course, I'm not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but I also remember like the kind of infamous gun incident or segment that took place as well, and wondering out what in the world just happened. So I do remember his, the little time he spent in the WWF, and I mean, he was a character.
Yeah, I mean, they did some interesting stuff. They really blurred the lines together. With them putting him and Austin together, it was kind of like, it was dangerous because Austin was the golden goose. I mean, he really wasn't yet, but he was, everybody recognized, like, this is the next guy at this point in time. And so involving Pillman here, I mean, they still had a lot of faith in him because he could have derailed Austin's career had this not all, had some of this stuff gone poorly. But they did the home invasion segment, which, they did that years later with like Triple H and Randy Orton, and it went over like a fart in church. But
kind of like the match,
yeah. I mean, it went over better than the match. We've talked about that on here at some point in time. That match was horrendous, and the crowd. You would think it was filmed during the COVID era with nobody in the audience.
No, there were no piped in cheering that would have helped the match.
Yeah, that's true. Before they figured out how to pipe in the cheering, when it was just the empty arena. But yeah, I mean, a lot of these things, they just kind of let Stone Cold and Brian Pillman wing it. Caleb, what did you think about these segments? Had you seen them before this?
I don't remember them like as a child or anything like that, but I remember watching them years later. And stuff like that. And it was interesting hearing Stone Cold go into the details because he's Stone Cold Steve Austin. So he's still going to talk like in his Stone Cold way. And when me and Brian locked up, man, I beat the shit out of him.
I loved that. He's like, hey man, I'm Stone Cold. I had to stomp his ass.
I stomped a butthole in his ass and walked it dry. I was like, oh my god! Like, what was interesting about that too is my aunt was watching that with me, and she's not that big of a wrestling fan or anything like that, but she loves documentaries like these, which is why I've said that this Dark Side of the Ring is such a brilliant idea. And stuff like that. But she was watching that and she was just like, that is just barbaric. And I was like, no, he didn't really kill him. Like he actually protected him. Like he didn't injure him any further. Stuff. So I love Stone Cold Steve Austin, especially in this and stuff like that. But I don't remember these segments, like I said, as a child, but I remember watching them later. the gun incident, I mean, at times I can't tell if it was a bad idea or if it was a good idea, because I mean, I've watched that episode of Raw in full length, and I gotta tell you, man, I thought it was some good stuff. I know that some people might have a problem with it, and I have a problem with wrestling going that far, especially when you involve like the talks of, hey, we're going to go out of the realms of pro wrestling, and this is going to become like an action movie type thing, or even a horror movie intense scene moment, because it's like, let's say Pillman, his leg was fine and we got a one-on-one match between the two. If you've pulled a gun out on someone, what is the point in having a rules contested matchup?
Oh, it's a gun and a pole match. You see, you take a pole in the corner, you put the gun at the top, and then whoever gets the gun first doesn't win, but they get to shoot the other person, so then they win.
Okay. So it's one bro. So it's a fucking swerve.
Yeah,
it's a swerve. And then what would make it even better is if he pulls down the gun and the gun doesn't even fucking fire.
And then you have the other person pull out an actual gun, and then like it's a double swerve.
Oh, it's a double swerve.
Yeah.
But then he goes to fire that one, and all that comes out is the little red flag bang.
And then we get like a like 2 hours earlier flashback of like Pillman goes up and replaces the gun on the thing with the fake gun. You know.
Oh my
Jesus
God.
Christ. You know, and the irony here is they didn't know that like 30 years later, you know, the wrestling on television, they would be hitting each other with so many moves that you would think shooting them with a gun is the only way you could finish the match. and they won't do it.
Right.
However, we now get into the dark side of the ring. So, you know, we get to the point where Pillman really, and they said, honestly, this would have gone a lot better for him if he hadn't rushed his return. But as we hear so many times in these stories of like wrestling from like the 70s to like the late 90s, in that era, it was like, if I take time off to heal, my spot's gone. You know, there was this mentality of like, I have to be out there all the time. And there is a huge element to that. Wrestling is very much a what have you done for me lately business. It's really, you know, you can fade from the spotlight very, very quickly. And a lot of these guys were very conscious of that fact and very conscious of the fact that their spot could be gone when they come back. There were not a lot of spots at the top. There were certainly not a lot of spots of being like partnered up with Steve Austin and getting to work with Steve Austin.
And Pillman didn't really even have a spot to begin with. You know, he's just entering the company.
Right. And he's like, I got to go to work. I got to make this money. So he rushes through the recovery. You know, he probably would have been a lot better off if he had taken, you know, a few extra months and not gone and done television and been on bed rest and, you know, done physical therapy. But, you know, he rushed the recovery. He started using pain meds to get through it. And, you know, Linda, his sister, talks about it in the documentary that, you know, he would take the pain meds until it didn't hurt anymore. And as we know from seeing this tons and tons of times, when you have that mentality, you know, opioids in general, your body adapts to them. You develop a tolerance. And so when you're taking this stuff every single day, all day, you know, every time the pain, you got to get rid of the pain again, you have to take more. And then it's very easy to end up in a situation where, you know, it's a substance abuse scenario. And that's exactly what happened with him. They were saying he barely could walk through the airport.
Yeah.
You know,
they were saying that when he would get home, as she talked about it, when he would get home, he would literally have to fill up on IV and stuff like that, like, because he would lose so much blood from him wrestling on it and stuff like that.
Because you'd also get infections. I mean, like
Yeah.
if because that's just how quickly he rushed his recovery, using quotation marks recovery, because he didn't really have a proper recovery.
No.
And but at the same time, like we'll never truly know the answer as to like what his mentality was. But you know, kind of what you alluded to earlier, James, like the fact that he was probably worried about his spot. Like to an extent, he did have a guaranteed contract, so it's not like the money would just stop completely coming in if he took time off. But looking down the road, yeah, his spot would have probably been taken. And so his mindset during this whole thing was, I just got to find a way to get through it. But he wasn't just a man who was in it for the money. He was also a man who was in it for the passion. I wonder, like, if the thought, like, what was his mentality when the thought came to mind, like, maybe I won't be able to do this the way I once was.
Right. I mean, that had to have run through his head so many times, especially when he was, still in the wheelchair and everything. It's like, am I ever going to be able to perform again? Um, and we get to the point where Jim Ross arranges, kind of picks up on this happening and realizes that it's gotten so far out of control, and arranges to have, a drug test for him when he gets to work that day. And, when you get into this mindset where you're an addict and, everybody else always realizes you're an addict before you realize you're an addict. And he's got this mentality where you're either with him or against him. And knowing what we know about Jim Ross's time as a head of talent relations, he was probably, being pretty straightforward here that he was literally looking out for Brian Pillman and trying to save his life. But they weren't going to find, what they really needed to find. They weren't going to find because he had prescriptions for what he was taking for the most part.
Yeah. And JR is that type of guy, we know. Like, he will go out of his way to help people.
Yeah, exactly.
Like he'll go out of his way to help the boys, basically.
So we get to Bad Blood, In Your House 97. And we're familiar with this type of story, unfortunately. Day of the pay-per-view gets there. Nobody knows where Pillman is. So they start calling around looking for him. I felt absolutely awful for Jim Cornette here because being on the other end of this phone call had to have been absolutely terrible. He calls the hotel, and the hotel manager informs him that Brian Pillman has died in his hotel room. Cornette did talk about this on his podcast. He basically said, every time they come out there, they have points where they have to like stop the interview because like he just like bursts into tears, and this was one of them. What do you guys think about this entire situation, where the position Cornette was in, and what ultimately ended up happening to Pillman?
I couldn't even begin to imagine being in that position. I mean, here you are, you're Jim Cornette, or you're Bruce Pritchard, or you're Jim Ross, you're just showing up to do a wrestling show. At no point do you think, hey, I'm going to have to call to find a talent and find out that they're dead, kind of thing. Like, how do you prepare for something like that? Especially when you're close friends with that talent. Like Jim Cornette talked about it. He was a good friend of Brian Pillman's. He liked Brian Pillman. So I can't even imagine. I can't imagine what he was feeling, what Steve Austin and the talent were feeling and stuff like that when that happened. And keep in mind too, that this pay-per-view, while it starts off that way, with announcing Pillman's death and everything like that, this pay-per-view Bad Blood has one of the best matches of all time in the Shawn Michaels Undertaker Hell in a Cell matchup. The very first matchup, I mean, that matchup is incredibly good from start to finish. It's one of my favorite matches of all time. But so it's interesting that this pay-per-view features such a good match, but then there's also this dark spotlight, I should say, that's being put on it. Like I said, I couldn't even imagine. And again, I find it kind of funny because I've heard obviously Jim Cornette's podcast, and he's just like, well, they ruined my kayfabe again. They show that I have a heart.
Yeah, I mean this is like the really like the roughest part of the episode, and putting myself in Cornette's position, I just feel completely awful. You know, situations like that always feel like an outer body experience, like you're all of a sudden snatched from reality and now you're experiencing a bad dream. It's always kind of what situations like that feel like. But I think even more so, like, I look at this thing from Pillman's, you know, what his POV must have been, which was, I just got to take a few more of these so I can make it to the show and so I can do what I'm supposed to do. You know, like, I would imagine that, like, the entire time he was still focused on working the match, doing his job, putting food on the table for his family, you know, and it's so hard at times to find any kind of silver lining or any kind of, you know, positive spin on things like this. And sometimes there isn't any, but you know, when I look at it from that perspective, it's like to the end, the man tried his damnedest to do his job.
Yeah, and you know, I think the thing that's the saddest part for me listening to the story is, you know, I can't imagine what he was thinking at that moment, like when he just lays down to go to bed pretty much, and then he doesn't wake up. Like I just ugh,
I mean, and the thing is, you know, his father died of a huge heart attack at 55.
Right.
He
Right.
was already genetically like predisposed to having a heart condition. So you know, the substance abuse and the growth hormones and all of that definitely didn't help.
Yeah.
yeah.
And right now, this is where Ace is thinking, why can't these motherfuckers have me on here to talk about Nick Gage or like a wrestling company going under or like Herb
Oh, like
Abrams?
Herb Abram, yeah, like
Yeah,
this is always like the
it's like
super sad
it's like,
shit.
oh, someone died, their family's insanely broken up about it. Let's have him on.
Like, I probably would have shot you down for the Owen Hart episode had you invited me for that one.
I
Like,
couldn't. I thought about putting, you know, I really did. I thought about inviting somebody on for that episode.
Thank God we didn't.
I just couldn't do it to anyone. Like, it's the saddest episode. And I don't mean to do compared suffering here because, I mean, this is tragic. The Benoit episode, oh my God. I mean, it's just beyond tragic. But the Owen episode was the hardest one to talk about and the hardest one to watch for me. Just because, like, you know, he and his family are victims in that story, 100%. It's not like you know this example where you know nobody, you know, Pillman was in bad shape, but nobody made him have that wreck. Nobody made him, you know, not do the recovery. But nobody made him take these pills. You know what I'm saying? He's culpable in what happened to an extent. Chris Benoit, I mean, obviously, we don't have to go into that. Owen Hart didn't do anything but love his family and show up to work. You know what I'm saying? It's fucking terrible. Anyway, I don't want to talk about it anymore. I can't do
Thank
it.
you.
It was awful. It was fucking awful, and I could not invite anybody on to put them through that shit. But anyway, this episode, it of course takes a horribly dark turn here. We get to the Melanie Pillman interview. If we had forgotten that Melanie is the villain of this story, we quickly get reminded, and I do want to point out too that Cornette, of course, is very close to this whole situation, and he pointed out too that in the documentary, like, it kind of seems like she's the villain of the story, but he was like, even if they had just given you just the facts, that's it. Like a list of facts about this scenario, you still would have come to that same conclusion
Yeah.
on your own. He's like, no one liked her at all.
No.
And, you know, she went on and did this damn interview, and, you know, you want to blame Vince because we always want to blame Vince McMahon for everything. And about 90% of that shit's his fault.
Yeah.
But she admitted that she was in no way pressured into the interview. I mean, it's such a shitty segment to put on your wrestling show. Oh, well, this guy died. We're going to have a live interview from his living room with a dying widow. I mean, with his widow. Can you imagine if they did that today with anyone?
This was one of the shittiest things. And actually, it's hard to compile like a list of top 10 shitty things that Vince has done. That's an episode for you guys. You're welcome. But
that, yes.
All right.
Like, it's hard to think about, you know, like some of the absolute shittiest things that Vince has done and like where certain things rank. But I think that this probably has a spot on that list. You know, like you just said, having the grieving widow do a live interview to talk about her recently deceased husband. I mean, how much more grimy can you get? And also, like you said, the blame for this is two ways. It's not just Vince, but Melanie as well. Like her, I'm not gonna say that it was performative in any way, because I'm sure that she had a lot of actual emotions about the passing of Brian. But what who would agree to do something like this when they just lost their significant other? People grieve in different ways, so I'm not, you know, grief shaming, but it just doesn't seem that natural. It doesn't seem that respectful either.
I'm fucking grief shaming her. I don't care. I normally would never do that, but fuck her. And fuck Vince McMahon. And we are gonna do that episode now. And I don't know if this will even make the top 10.
Oh.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ. Anyway, so here we go. You know, we have Pillman's family, and they go from having silver spoon in their mouths. None of his kids have ever really wanted for anything because their dad's a famous star on television. And now that money, that income's gone. So now you've gone from a situation where you know, you were there with your dad and he was providing for you. You may not have liked his wife, but whatever. Now she's taking care of kids that she doesn't really even look at as hers, because they're, I mean, technically not. And doesn't have a good way to make ends meet. If there was life insurance money, I mean, they don't talk about this, but that shit was probably gone. So like, you've got all of the kids now are in this situation where they don't know where their next meal's coming from, and and they have to deal with the loss of their father at the same time. I mean, it is incredibly tragic. Stovall, what did you think about that part of the episode?
Yeah, I didn't realize how bad it got for them and stuff like that. It definitely drove home the picture that she is the villain, like you said, of this entire story. And the way that they talk about her, I mean, the way that, especially Brittany fucking hates her. Like,
and who could blame her?
Yeah, I mean, I can't blame her, but then, you know, at the same time, she doesn't hate, you know, Brian Pillman Jr. kind of thing. And I think his story is really interesting because he's caught in the middle of all this. You know, you can't hate him, but they hate his mother pretty much. And maybe hate is a wrong word, but they extremely dislike each other.
No, I think Brittany definitely hates her.
Yeah. She does.
I mean, you feel awful for her because her mother and father are now gone at a very young age.
Yeah.
And then nothing gets better. I mean, things just get worse. I mean, you know, she nearly died of alcohol poisoning when Pillman Jr. was 12.
Yeah.
You know, she's depressed. She's sleeping all the time. She gets a new husband who seems like a real shitbag.
Yeah.
he didn't want to talk to them. He didn't want to talk to Vice about it. So he obviously knew that he was going to be outed for
Yeah.
shit,
Yeah.
and probably couldn't account for it. I'm going to tell you, the section here with Pillman Jr. was one of the hardest things I've ever watched.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, man. When he talked about the feelings that he had with his dad and everything like that, that was where I got misty eyed.
Yeah, I was probably a little past misty eyed when
Yeah,
I was watching it because, you know, first of all, knowing him and knowing what kind of like a carefree sort of like really like happy person he is, and then knowing what he went through as a kid, and I identified with his situation a lot. My father died at a young age as well. I didn't get along with my stepdad. I didn't go through the kind of abuse that he went through. That was terrible. I mean, they had like dogs trained to keep him in his room. But I definitely identified a lot, and I think a lot of people do with that kid that doesn't want to deal with reality and they want to sit in their room and play video games. And that's their escape from their shitty childhood. I think a lot of people, can identify with that, and especially people around our age,
yeah,
people that came up that way. And it was so hard to see him talking about like the fact that it was basically like he didn't have a father growing up because his dad died when he was very young, and his stepfather was anything but a father figure to him. And it's kind of horrifying.
yeah,
Yeah.
and especially when he was talking about like that he is pursuing wrestling now, and that his family is very worried that they're just like, hey, you cannot repeat the cycle kind of thing. That was really tough to hear, and hearing that he wanted to be there for his kids, whenever he has a child and stuff like that, just very hard. You were about to say something, Ace?
I was gonna say like Pillman Jr. seems very cognizant of like maybe some of the mistakes that his father made, and he seems very aware that he's trying to work on making sure that he doesn't fall into some of those same pitfalls. And I think that that's something that's a really strong takeaway. And like with most episodes of Dark Side of the Ring, like no matter how dark or how tragic things get, they always try to find some kind of light, some kind of hope at the end of the tunnel. And for the Pillman episodes, I feel like it's through his son, it's through Pillman Jr. is where they really try to put the focus of hope that on him. Like the legacy of Brian Pillman lives on through his son, who looks so much like him, who is in the business. And I really enjoyed the part when Pillman Jr. said that, yeah, I think my dad would approve. I mean, he gave me his name. It's kind of like, a rite of passage. So I thought that was really cool, and just it, if AEW, if they really had, their act together, I think that they would be like, hey, now it's maybe the time to showcase them a little bit more on AEW. I think that'd be, but anyways, that's neither here nor there. I think that showcasing Pillman Jr. was perfect to kind of bring me out of that slump, of witnessing his dad's death and the evil shit that Melanie did and all the things that the kids had to endure.
I love where he talks about his relationship with his mom and how he's chosen not to hate her, because that says more about him than it does about her. It's
Yeah.
not doing him any good. It's one thing to say I'm not going to let this person bring their toxicity into my life, but if it's purely just you're holding a grudge against your own mother because of what's happened in the past, that's on you. And him choosing not to walk around with that, I think, speaks very highly to his maturity level and him as a person. Not to mention, I love him performing as a wrestler. I think he caught on to it so quickly. From his sisters kind of talking about like, this dude never worked out a day in his life. He's just a nerd sitting in his room playing video games. And then he pursues wrestling, he gets in shape, he gets trained, he very quickly. I mean, when they say that it's in your blood, I mean, he's kind of evidence of that because for him to be doing this as long as he has, you can say what you want about, you know, he is Brian Pillman Jr. He's got that name out there. He is a second generation wrestling star. And that gives you a certain leg up in the business. But, I mean, it's not like we would have never heard of this guy if he wasn't Brian Pillman Jr. He's got it.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah.
You know, he's got the look, the it factor, the talent.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that, Ace, about AEW. The Varsity Blondes are actually challenging for the tag team championships.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah.
And he's not going to be a single star right off the bat. And I can tell you because he still has a long way to go.
He does.
He has, he has a long way to go. So you can't just right now, make him the top guy right now. But he's definitely got it in him. And I found it so interesting that he was playing his father during these reenactments. Like, how weird does that have to be a little bit?
Yeah.
I think it'd be weirder if they got anyone else to do it.
Well, true. I mean,
probably.
Well, which actually he didn't do the loose cannon part, did he?
Yeah, no, it's like for more like the performative stuff, it seems like not really, so yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and Griff Garrison's his tag partner. I want to mention this real quick in AEW. Griff Garrison's actually Griff Garrison is actually a Georgia wrestling star. I mean, he was very just very recently on the Indies, more in like West Georgia, out this way towards Atlanta area. He didn't really ever make it to like East Georgia very often, but he has had kind of a meteoric rise as well, and he also kind of has it. So it's kind of interesting that he also ends up in a tag team. They're the Varsity Blondes. Both of the guys are very promising. It reminds you of the Hollywood Blondes a lot, and not to mention Pillman Jr.'s got Stone Cold Steve Austin backing him, and Jim Ross, which that's not bad to have if you're trying to get into the wrestling business.
Yeah, those aren't two names whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, I can guarantee you right now, most of the people in AEW never had a conversation with Stone Cold Steve Austin in their lives.
Yeah.
And would probably kill to have one. And then Jim Ross works there, of course, but I mean, Jim Ross has signed the best talent over the last 30 years, hands down.
Absolutely.
And I would argue that with anybody all day. So there you go. And is it an unfair advantage? I don't give a shit. I mean, everything this dude went through as a childhood, and it's not like he's not putting, in his childhood, and it's not like he's not putting in the work. I'm very glad to see what he's doing in the industry.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I want to ask you guys one more thing here before we kind of wrap up. Austin ends the episode by saying that the loose cannon gimmick is one of the best gimmicks ever created. We'll start with you, Ace. I want to know what you think about that. Do you agree, disagree?
So I do agree, but with an asterisk. Like, I think that the loose cannon gimmick all on its own is very, very good. It does depend on who's running it, because technically you could say that's what Dean Ambrose tried to do when he was in WWE. It was a kind of a loose cannon gimmick. Clearly and obviously that it did not to the same effect or positive results as to what Pillman did. The loose cannon gimmick works for two reasons. One, because of the man who's behind the gimmick, the mind of Brian Pillman Sr., like he just knew how to make that thing work. And two, this was during a time period where the cat was pretty much out of the bag about pro wrestling, but now we're seeing things from behind the curtain for the first time through Brian Pillman Sr. And what he did with that gimmick was a lot of people to wonder, man, so what's real and what's a work here? And he worked not just the fans, but he worked a lot of people in the industry. So I think that kind of all those things coupled together, that and he had just more freedom to do different things back then than what a person would have today if they ran a similar gimmick. So yeah, I do think it's a phenomenal gimmick. I don't think that if any other workers could have done it as well. And I don't know if you can do it today to the same results.
Caleb, what about you?
I think it's definitely one of the best, but I think that there's also that it's also a hindrance as well, because while it allowed him to go far, it allowed him to go too far, as you saw. Like there was no limits with him, and when I say that it was a hindrance, I think that he got so far into the gimmick that it's, dare I say it, with one of superhero homies sitting here and two comic book lovers sitting here. It's like the Joker. He went too far with it. He didn't know when to stop, kind of thing.
To be fair, the Joker has pulled that same gun gag several times.
Yeah,
That he has.
Yep. So I just think that while it was good, there also was a lot of negativity with it. So you could look at it either way. Now, could that be just because it was Brian Pillman and that he didn't know how to handle a lot of that stuff? That's one thing. You could make that argument. I think several people have tried it. Like you mentioned Dean Ambrose. We'll mention James' favorite wrestler of all time, Kenny Omega. He's been accused of that one, or he has been compared to Brian Pillman in that instance and everything like that. And you can hate on him all you want to, but he did. Because I can already see the reactions.
Okay, all right. Okay. Other than having a mullet, who the fuck is comparing Kenny Omega to Brian Pillman?
They did when he first kind of took on that persona in New Japan.
Okay, New Japan Kenny Omega, not like
New Japan,
on American soil.
I'm not talking about right now, but I'm talking about as he was coming along there in New Japan and before he started the feud with Okada and stuff like that. He was very much compared to Brian Pillman as far as the loose cannon persona.
I got to be honest. I'm not jumping on the hate wagon, but I didn't know that Kenny Omega had a gimmick.
Oh, y'all will never work for AEW.
Oh, AEW never hired me anyway. They should, but they never will. I promise you that. But they absolutely should. I could turn that shit around in like 2 weeks.
But I just find it interesting though that Stone Cold calls Brian Pillman's gimmick the greatest gimmick of all time, when it was like, yeah, but Pillman never drew the amount of money that you drew, Steve, with your gimmick. So,
he didn't have the amount of time either, though.
I mean, true, but I'm just saying,
Here's the problem with that. First off, I think I could see like maybe Kenny Omega being compared to like Pillman after the car wreck. But also, I want to say that the problem with the loose cannon gimmick is that, as you kind of pointed out, Caleb, you have to constantly take it further.
Yeah.
It's not Stone Cold where it's just like, I can be this guy. You have to constantly keep blurring these lines. It's kind of the same thing we ran into with New Jack, where it's like, when the spectacle and the shock is what the gimmick is based off of, that has a very short lifespan.
Yeah.
So you constantly have to find new ways to amp it up. And I don't know. I mean, I think it would have been very much a situation like a Shawn Michaels, Marty Jannetty thing when this feud between the two of them finally ended. I think Stone Cold goes to the top. And I don't know if Pillman does or not. We'll never know. But there's only so far you really could take that gimmick. And I think he would have continued to be a staple of the wrestling industry for a long time. But you can't see Pillman continuing into the PG era.
No.
They wouldn't have given this guy a live mic anytime in the last decade.
No, and I also think that after a while, he wouldn't even act like the gimmick.
Right.
He would just be Pillman. After that.
And that probably would have worked for him.
Probably.
Yeah, I mean, if nothing else, like he really showed that he knew how to reinvent himself. You know what I mean? So, but so in sticking in terms with what the gimmick have worked continuing, well, the way that WWE went, no. But in terms of what the man have found success, while we'll never truly know. I think because he just continues to find ways to reinvent himself or to make himself a hot ticket item. I think he would have found yet another way.
I mean, he certainly had the ring skills and the it factor.
Yeah.
Prior to the wreck, he definitely had that. And even after the wreck, he didn't have the ring skills anymore, but he still had the it factor. And it's like Jim Ross says in the episode, if he would have hung it up and, gone into another area of the wrestling business, he could have done very well for himself. That being said, I do want to go ahead and get everybody's closing thoughts on this before we wrap it up. Caleb, you got anything else? Any closing thoughts on this episode?
Yeah, if I have told this story before on here, then I apologize. I might have said it in the first one. Brian Pillman has one of those moments that got me into pro wrestling. And it's not one of those moments that you generally think of. When people think of that, then they're like, oh, well, that match that he had with Jushin Thunder Liger or the Hollywood Blondes era or this and that. It was actually from just a regular WCW Saturday night, just a regular matchup. Basically what had happened was at Fall Brawl, Johnny B. Bad and Brian Pillman fought to determine the number one contender for Sting's U.S. title, I think, at the time. And Johnny B. Bad ended up winning the matchup, but then something happened and he wasn't able to show up. And I remember watching this live with my dad, and so Johnny B. Bad can't make it. So then they're like, okay, well, then we got to go with Brian Pillman. So they bring Brian Pillman out, and him and Sting have this matchup. Wasn't a 5-star matchup, wasn't anything special. But the moment at the end of the match when Sting hooks the Scorpion Deathlock on Pillman, because Pillman's a bad guy at this point, people are losing their minds in the stands and stuff like that. And my dad, I remember him sitting on the couch, and when he taps out, Dad just like, yay! Because he was a big Sting fan. And that moment right there was when I got hooked on pro wrestling. And it just goes to show you that if you have even the simplest matchup, you never know what matchup is influencing someone. I know a lot of people are going to say, oh, well, it's that Rock versus Austin, or the Rock versus Hogan, or Hogan versus Andre, Steamboat versus Savage. All those other matchups you could throw in there. But there was a Saturday night matchup, like nothing special, no pay-per-view quality, no nothing about it. But it got me hooked so much on pro wrestling after that. And here was what was even better, was I was able to tell Pillman Jr. that when he came here to Augusta. That was really cool. So that's always a moment that I'll have, and it's always a moment that I'll treasure. So, if nothing else, if nothing else with the loose cannon stuff and the Hollywood Blondes and all that, Brian Pillman has that impact on me and will forever have that kind of impact on me. And I'm not going to lie, I got a little tear on my eye there.
That was an amazing story.
Yeah.
That was an amazing story. I was not prepared for that.
Yeah. I was waiting
thank you for sharing that.
For this part too.
That's a fantastic story.
Yeah.
Ace, what you got, man? You got any amazing Brian Pillman stories you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, man. So like I walked past this building and it was on fire, man. And I looked up and I said, man, that's Brian Pillman Jr. I gotta go in there and see if I can. And I was able to go in there, man, and like I was able to get him out. We jumped from the 3rd story, man, but I was able to take the brunt of the fall. And he goes, "Thank you, man. Like that, I'll never forget that." And it's like, yeah, man. But I mean, like other than that little thing,
Ace, I have one thing to say to you.
Yeah.
Sweet Caroline. Oh, oh, oh.
I hate you both. I hate you both.
Okay, so
Next time I come on your podcast, the shenanigans are coming out.
no, this is a one-way street.
Oh, okay. Okay. Think, Mark, think.
Oh, but when I think about Pillman Jr. or like when you think about you know, any past, wrestling superstar, the one thing I always think about like is of course like legacy and how we can best remember these wrestlers who have come and gone before us. And for me, I think that when you think about the impact that they've had and how lasting it is, and we spoke earlier about other people trying to, if not imitate, then do their own version of the kind of gimmick that Pillman Sr. had. And I think that that goes to kind of say a lot about the impact that he had on the industry and on the fans. Because the fact of the matter is, a lot of people really, myself included, really enjoy the kind of gimmick that this guy had. And, when I think about Pillman, it's like he had a lot to offer. And unfortunately, we never really got to see the pinnacle of what he could have done. Uh, I'll never be able to kind of erase from, my what if section of my brain, the fact that we'll never have seen a prime healthy Pillman Jr. versus a prime Stone Cold Steve Austin in a, built up feud from 90s era wrestling. I think that is something that I wish we could have gotten.
You
But
said Pillman Jr. You meant
no, see,
Pillman. But damn it,
actually,
now I really want to see Pillman Jr. versus Stone
yeah,
Cold.
I was like, hey, let's make it happen. Yeah. I'm
That
speaking.
could still happen.
I'm speaking things into existence now. You know what I mean? Speaking truth to reality.
If Steve Austin was going to come out of retirement for anything, I think that would be it. It'll never happen, but if he was going to, I could totally see him coming in and putting over Pillman Jr. Imagine that rub, right?
Shit.
Yeah.
That'd be incredible.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I want to see it now. I'm right there with you. The what ifs around this are disheartening at best. So yeah, I mean, I actually I think we just lost Caleb.
Oh.
But that's good that we were wrapping up the episode anyway. Now we have you and then a very big close up of your shirt there.
All right, not a sponsor. I should have wore the superhero homie shirt today.
Yeah, not a sponsor. Also, today this podcast has been brought to you by Coke Zero. Also, not a sponsor at all. Anyway, we were just about to wrap it up anyway. I don't know where Caleb disappeared to, but Ace, thank you so much for being on the program. Yet again, next time we have you on here, I promise it'll be something a little bit lighter. But we had a lot of laughs here today, regardless of the seriousness of this episode. That being said, man, we're gonna wrap this one on up, and this has been an Involved Review.